Hi, everybody. This video is to help you get ready to organize your data for the Animal Behavior Research Project Preliminary Data Analysis Lab. In this week's lab, you and your group are going to be focused on doing a preliminary analysis of the data that you've gathered over the course of the semester for whatever your behavior project was that you all designed. This specific video is going to focus on gathering data through focal sampling with continuous recording and how to organize it appropriately. If you'd like to follow along with this example of how to get the data organized into a format that will allow you to do appropriate statistics and graphing, please feel free to see the Excel spreadsheet that contains exactly this data that's in our modules page in Carmen under the lab resources module for this week. So you're welcome to follow along. And again, these videos aren't intended to show you exactly the way that you formatted your data, but just give you an idea of some useful tips and tricks for getting data from a raw, relatively unorganized format to a format that's going to let you do your analysis really easily. Okay, so the example data that we're going to look at is from a previous group of students who were investigating variation in the duration of eating among American cockroaches in tanks that were a hotter temperature versus a colder temperature. So what our students did was select a focal individual during their observation session and then watch that individual cockroach for about 10 minutes. While they were watching that focal individual, they noted the total duration in seconds of every bout of eating. So you can see how they've got their data organized here. We have different group members' contributions labeled here, group member 1 versus group member 2. Group member 3 and group member 4. And they've noted the temperature of the tank that they were observing, each of the 3 focal individuals that they watched per 30-minute observation session, and the total duration of eating for each individual that they were watching for the 10-minute period. So this data looks pretty well organized, right? But the problem that we've got here is that with each of these individual data tables and not having the data organized by tank condition, it would make it really difficult to calculate averages, standard errors, variances, run your t-tests, and create those bar graphs. So what we're going to do is think a little bit about how we can go from these data that are kind of individually organized based on group member to a compiled data format that's going to let you do the analyses that you need to. So the way that I've got this organized is that I've got an unorganized raw data tab, and then I also have a separate tab for the process of organizing those data and a finalized data tab that you could actually use for a nice clean analysis. So all I've done to get myself started for the organizing process tab is just straight up copy and paste over the data that we originally had. Now, the first thing that I want to do is go from data that's organized based on which group member collected the data to data that's organized based on tank condition, because that's the independent variable that I think might be driving differences in my dependent, which is the duration of eating. Okay, so first thing that I want to do is move all that data over into a format that's organized by temperature. So what I'm going to do is just gather all of the data for the hot temperature tank first. So I am going to, didn't do that quite right. Control C, and I'm going to copy and paste that over there, and I'm going to gather up all of the data for the hot tanks. Now you'll notice I'm not bothering to copy and paste over focal, individual, and duration of eating as column headers every time, because now that I'm making a unified data table, that's already up there. I don't have to recopy that over. So now I'm just going to grab the rest of my hot tank data. Here we go. And one more from group member 4. Okay. Now, at this point, the first thing that I want to do before I continue on is make sure that I've got this data labeled as coming from the hot tank. So I'm going to make a new column header that I'm just going to call temperature, and then I'm going to type hot. Now, an easy way that I can get all of these cells labeled as hot is if I just hover my cursor, so I've got my cursor there, and I hover it over the bottom right-hand corner of that cell, and then I double click. Here we go. And Excel is going to auto-populate all of that with hot for me. So now I know that where the focal individual was observed and where that duration of eating was observed, all in the hot tank. So now all I need to do is bring over all of my cold tank data. So I'm going to do the same thing, again, not worrying about bringing over those column headers because I've already got those now that I've got a nice unified table. So just copying and pasting those over, and I have to get the cold tank data from the bottom here. One more to copy and paste over. There we go. And now all I need to do is the exact same thing I did with the hot tank, where I just write that this comes from the colder conditions and do that little double click with my hash there, showing that all of these cells indicate data taken from the cold tank condition. Cool. So already we're in a much better place thinking about analyzing our data, but we have another problem. When we look at the duration of eating, for some of the individuals, they only did one bout of eating during the observation. So for example, at the very top here, individuals 1 and 2 ate for 64 seconds and 35 seconds, all in one bout, and that's it. That's nice and easy. But when we look at some of our observations, like focal individual 3 here, we can see that they engaged in multiple bouts of eating. The first was 12 seconds, second was 68, and the third was 7 seconds. Now, each of those individual data points is interesting, but what we care about is the sum total duration of eating during each observation bout. So what we need to do is sum up all of these totals. Now, what I'm going to do is show you a handy trick for how to not do that all by hand, which will be really nice. Okay. So what you're going to do, and I'm just moving my little Zoom thingy here so that I can actually see the Excel commands. What you need to do first is highlight all the data that you're interested in. So I've just highlighted this column of all the durations of eatings. Then what you're going to do is go up to your Excel ribbon and hit on the data tab. Click on that data tab. In data, you're going to see an option called text to columns. What text to columns is going to let us do is take these series of values within a cell and take those values out of a single cell and spread them out among different cells so that we can treat each of those as an individual data point. Okay, so we're going to click on our text to columns and it's going to pull up this little convert text to columns wizard. We're going to tell it that we have delimited data. Delimited data just means that we've got our individual values within a cell separated by some divider like a column or a tab. So then we're going to click next. After that, we're going to let it know how our data is divided. In our case, we've got those values separated by a comma. So I'm going to tell it I'm comma separated. And what it's going to do at that point is show me a little preview of how it's going to separate out my data where it should be separated. I see that it's dividing that out just the way I want it to. So I'm going to tell it next, good job, and finish. And at this point, now I've got all those individual pieces of data separated out into separate cells where I want them. So at this point, I've really only got one last thing that I want to do, which is to sum up those durations of eating. So what I'm going to do is make a new column called sum durations. And all I'm going to do here is, again, get Excel to do all the math for me. So I'm going to tell Excel, I want you to sum up any values that appear in these sets of 3 columns. So what I do is type in an equal, then sum, parentheses, and now I just highlight all the columns that I potentially want to be summed. And at that point, I end parentheses and hit enter. Now for 64, it's not doing anything with those other 2 columns because there's no data in it. But if I just grab the end of that cell and pull it all the way down to the very last row in my data table, what that does is automatically sum up all those durations for me. So now at this point, I have a representative duration of eating for each individual that was observed during my study. So at this point, I'm ready to put all of that into a nice organized form in my organized data tab. All I've done in this organized data tab is take those temperature labels that we already made, taken those focal individual labels that we've already got, and then just copied over my sum durations in seconds. So at this point, I've got all of my individual data points for hot gathered in one concise location. I've got all of them for cold in one concise location. And at that point, it's going to be really easy for me to follow those examples to figure out my averages, my variances, standard deviations, standard errors, and then ultimately plot those out on a bar graph and run a t-test to determine whether or not I do have significant differences between groups. So again, this probably isn't exactly how your data is organized, but you can still follow along with those general principles and tips for how to get your data organized appropriately. All right, everybody, have a good day and happy data organizing. Good luck.